I'd like to now introduce our moderator for the evening, Neil Skeen. Neil is perhaps best known around Florida for his column on state government for Florida Trend, and as a St. Petersburg Times bureau chief in Tallahassee in the 1980s. Formerly editor and president of Congressional Quarterly, Neil is now vice chairman of Med Affinity Corporation, a Tallahassee-based company providing next-generation electronic health records technology to medical professionals. And he didn't even ask me if I could invest. Is it too late? No. It sounds pretty good. He is also a member of the board of directors of the Village Square. Neil.
I need my valet.
Okay, hold on.
Oh, all right. Great. Well, I'll tell you, if you're concerned about violence in media, Roseanne, there's a lot of dismembering going on here tonight. But it's a full moon tonight. Explains a lot. And so I hope you're prepared for quite an evening. Tonight's program is Media Wars, the future of how and what we know. We're going to focus on the war between conservative and liberal media, on the war between, well, the east and west sides of Tampa Bay, between print and digital, and maybe even between young and old. We've got really an extraordinary panel, and I want to confess early on that there's a lot of St. Pete Times roots here, and some of that is probably my own fault. But I wanted to help us get together a group of people that we would all just love to spend an hour or two with, and these were people I could vouch for. And besides, there's no St. Pete Times anymore anyway, so I thought it would be okay. For two of our guests, this has really been an incredible couple of weeks. John Harwood, after being the moderator for the presidential debate in which Rick Perry had the oops moment heard round the world, was parodied on Saturday Night Live, played by Fred Armisen, and was on Stephen Colbert's Best Available panel. If you haven't seen that, he basically, whoever the first three people who respond to his phone call show up to be on Colbert. John was teamed up, among others, with David Cassidy, the teenage pop idol, whose roots in politics go to his parody of Hunter S. Thompson, and I'm not making up this title, "Come On, Get Happy, Fear and Loathing on the Partridge Family Bus." So John was the comic relief on that panel. Lucy Morgan was featured on National Public Radio in an interview with Noah Adams. Some of you probably heard that, those three of you who do listen to National Public Radio. And I personally was interviewed about politics by the guy next to me at the bar at Andrews. But I do want to, so first I want to, I want to say one other thing, because Liz introduced Laird and Flo Anderson, Laird Anderson, Flo Ashby. I have known them for many years. I'm so glad they've endowed this lecture series at FSU. They've been great contributors since they were in school at FSU a few years ago. And I just like to, Laird was a great journalist. He was with the Wall Street Journal and then taught at American University for many years in journalism. I'd just like to say thank you once again to you guys. So joining me, we're going to do sort of, if you're old enough, it's sort of like Johnny Carson, where we sort of have like the spotlight guests for a while, and then we just keep adding to the panel until finally they just move off the stage entirely. So the sort of the Ed McMahon of the evening is Lucy Morgan. I would like to think of her more as the Kathy Lee Gifford, But Lucy, come on up, Lucy. You get the... You get the left wing down there.
But I'm so right wing.
You're just always right. So Lucy and I together are going to interrogate a panel this evening. Everybody knows Lucy's story, but I can't help just telling a couple of things. She was the bureau chief in the St. Pete Times Bureau for 20-something years, about 20. I lasted only 4 in that job, so you can see how good she is.
How old I am now.
And I came before you.
True.
Her 1973 jail sentence was probably well-deserved, but was overturned by the Florida Supreme Court in what was really a landmark ruling for the reporter's ability to protect confidential sources. She won a Pulitzer Prize for exposing the corruption of, it's funny about this, the same sheriff whose jail she was in.
Now, wait just a minute. It was the prior sheriff I would have had to serve under, and he told me the best cell he had was mine.
Oh, okay. That was good. It always helps to have influence. She was named by Governor Jeb Bush to the Women's Hall of Fame. I got that right, right?
You did.
Okay. She always told me I asked dumb editor questions, so anything I could say to get back at this. One of my favorite lines about Lucy comes from Allison DeFore, our own Village Square board member, who says he met Lucy at a... Allison, it's hard to believe given his attire, but he was once the sheriff of Monroe County, or maybe it's not so hard to believe. And he says he met Lucy at a Florida Sheriff's Association meeting shortly after she won that Pulitzer for getting the sheriff, and he said the sheriffs flowed around her sort of like a school of fish around a shark. So anyway, welcome our co-host for the evening, Lucy Morgan.
Thank you, Neil. Neil once told me that if I ever wanted to give up the bureau chief's job, it was the best job he ever had, and he wanted to come back, and I agree. It is a great job. But we're here to talk a little bit about journalism, and I am, unlike some of my fellow journalists, fairly optimistic about journalism. I know we have seen the decline of some papers, some closer to us than others, but not a lot has changed. When I became a reporter in 1965, they handed me a camera I didn't know how to operate and told me I had to take all my own pictures. We're back to doing that these days. We're all taking pictures. We're shooting videos. We're blogging, we're tweeting, Facebooking, we're doing all of these kinds of things to communicate. And almost all of us have lost staff. I think we're going to go through, hopefully not too much longer, a period where you do see reduced staff and that we will shake out in the end, still delivering information. The method we deliver it is going to be different. I don't think any of us envisioned, certainly not 20 years ago, that we would be delivering things online or on a telephone or an iPad or all the other ways that you get your news. But I think we're going to see more of that. Probably things we haven't dreamed will exist will be the ways you get your news in another 20 years. Unfortunately, we've lost a lot of journalists. Some of them are now in state offices as public information officers and in other places. Some of them probably should have gone there earlier and didn't. But my greatest fear is that we're going to lose a lot of young reporters who feel threatened and really fearful about the industry and leave us too soon. Because I think on the other end of what's happening to journalism, we're going to still be delivering information to people and ferreting out wrongdoing among judges and anybody else that gets in our way, and that things will come out of this other end.
Well, we have a lot of people to help us talk about some of those things and what's going on in the future of media. Actually, I think that one of the things is that in the future, as an economic move, rather than having reporters covering all of the state agencies, that the now Tampa Bay Times is simply going to project a hologram of Lucy into every state agency.
A scarecrow?
Yeah, scarecrow. Yeah, that would be it. So, well, in putting together this panel, I thought it was about time that John Harwood came back to Tallahassee, and yeah, right. There have been some changes since John left here in, I guess it was end of 84, would have been when you left, to go cover the Reagan campaign from Washington for the St. Pete, what was the name of that paper? The St. Pete Times. Things have changed. John noticed when he came back to Tallahassee, the airport is now much larger. The planes, however, are much smaller. And there are not any more of them. John and I were in the St. Pete Times Bureau for about a little over a year together during the Graham administration. You remember Mary Childs is here. You remember the Bob Graham administration. John grew up in Bethesda, just outside of Washington. He was the son of a Washington Post political reporter, and ultimately deputy managing editor of the Post, Dick Harwood. He went to Duke, to college, and then came to the St. Petersburg Times he came as a summer intern, I think, in 1978. I think I got that right, or 77. 77, there you go. So he went to the Washington Bureau for the Times. In 1991, he became the White House correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. A great job. Then became the political editor and the chief political correspondent. Eventually, back then, CNBC and the Wall Street Journal were friends. And John started appearing on CNBC. He then moved full time to CNBC and sort of shifted to writing more for the New York Times. John has quite a schedule. He's going to be live on Squawk Box tomorrow at 6:10 a.m. From a studio here in town. We will be calling you with our roto dial at 6 to be sure you're up to listen. And his day can also end with Larry Kudlow at 7 o'clock. And so, he's a great journalist, he's a great friend, and so, straight from the set of the Colbert Report, let's welcome back to Tallahassee, John Harwood.
Oh, no. You may think that Neil has gone crazy, but back in the day when Neil and Harwood worked together in the Bureau, they were both single and much loved by all of these single women in the Capitol. I think they kept men's cologne in their desk drawers so that they could...
Didn't need it. We had to fight them off. Most of them came to see John.
Wow.
That was good. So who's better at this?
Is this on?
It's on. It's on. This is live.
Yeah. I'm still waiting for an email. My date might end tonight on the last word with Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC at 10:15. They're waiting to see if they can line up the studio.
We'll get you out of here in time.
So if you don't want to get up at 6:15, you could catch it before you go to bed. Although it's not must-see TV, I will say that.
Must see NBC, isn't that what MSNBC says?
exactly.
Yeah, so.
John, since you're going to be on tonight, can I ask you, what do you think of... today I am most aggravated when I turn on one of these television talk shows by the hosts who are screaming at their guests and interrupting them and not allowing them to answer questions and taking a position instead of pretending to be a journalist. What do you think of those people?
I think they are trying to make a living. One of the realities of our business, so the news and information business is under pressure in many ways, right? Newspapers trying to survive. Neil's trying to preserve the space and the penetration for the St. Pete Times, now Tampa Bay Times, changing the name as part of that. Television networks, cable TV also has to try to figure out a way to keep a foothold in a marketplace where broadcast TV is declining, cable's rising, but opinion cable is really rising, and opinion internet threatens to submerge all of it, all of the television stuff. So Fox built a very successful business model, self-consciously styling itself as the conservative alternative to the liberal mainstream media. And what has happened in response to Fox, which is so dominant, they're not just kicking our butt, they're kicking our butt big time. It's sort of like the way Florida State kicked the butt of Carolina in basketball a few weeks ago. That's how bad Fox is beating the rest of cable.
And Duke?
That was a more narrow and kind of an aberrational kind of game.
Would it be that you went to Duke, John?
Yes, I did. That was put that in the category of freak events. So you have CNN, which has always been a straight down the middle news organization, totally disoriented by the threat and the declining market share that it has. MSNBC, part of the network that I work for, has responded to that by trying to, in essence, be Fox on the left. And so Al Sharpton has a show, Ed Schultz has a show, Rachel Maddow has a show, Lawrence O'Donnell, the show that I might do tonight, he's a guy I used to cover. He was the staff director for the Senate Finance Committee when I was covering the Hill. And, you know, this is how this industry is trying to survive. People like me who don't do opinion journalism have to kind of fight for our continuing role in this process. You know, the more people who are willing to watch something that's more muted, less opinionated, less shouty, the better off we are. But so far, that model has not proven to be as robust as the others.
That's sad.
One of the really the highlights, I think, of your career was when, in an interview with you, President Obama uttered the words, "I got the sucker." Mm-hmm. And I believe he wasn't talking about Osama bin Laden.
We have had I've had a couple of interesting moments with Obama in interviews. You're talking about, I thought you were just about to say the moment when we were preparing for an interview, we were getting made up. I'd actually brought my daughter to the interview and was engaging in small talk with Obama, and he was asking my daughter where she wanted to go to college and all that. And it happened to be the night after Kanye West had snatched the microphone from Taylor Swift at the Country Music Awards. Does anybody remember that? And I said, "So, Mr. President, were your daughters as hacked off as mine were about what happened to Taylor Swift?" And he turns to my daughter, trying to relate to her, and said, "He was a jackass." And this was something that was not part of the interview. It was off the record, because when you're just chit-chatting, that's not considered, you know, and getting made up and mic'd up and all that, it's not really considered part of it. However, that video feed went out to every television network, and so a colleague, a friend of mine from ABC, Terry Moran, was watching that at his desk, didn't realize what it was, he just heard it, and so he tweeted, "Obama calls Kanye West a jackass." And that became a brief sensation. We wouldn't put it on TV, but other people eventually did because the video was out there. But you're talking about something different.
Yes. The sucker he got was not Osama bin Laden,
But a fly. You may remember when this was an interview in June of 2009. I believe that I was interviewing the president about his forthcoming Wall Street regulation bill. And we were, when you do an interview with the president, there's a whole lot of people involved. We had a fancy rig where the cameraman could glide down these rails and change the angle of the shot constantly, and you had sound people and lighting people and all that. And while we were there in the East Room, some people noticed that there was a rather large fly buzzing around the room, a singular fly. And a producer was assigned to take her legal pad and chase this fly out of the room. So she tried to chase it out of the room and actually did. and got the fly through these double doors to the room next to the East Room, shut the double doors. Right after that happened, the White House staffer came over and said, we want those doors open because we want depth to the president's shot, and if we have the doors open, the camera will shoot not just him, but the room behind him. It will look classier. So he said, okay. And we just decided, kind of forgot about the fly. And while the interview started, the fly's kind of like over here, and it's sort of moving closer, and, you know, Mr. President, what are you going to do about Too Big to Fail? Like a, and the thing was right, like circling in front of his nose, and he finally just started laughing and said, hold on a second. And he put his hand out. It was an awesome performance, actually. He put his hand out. The fly just perched on his hand, and one swat, he gets the fly, and he flicks it on the floor, and he does this kind of macho thing. He says, now, where were we? And the cameraman is interested, and he says, you want to see it? I got the sucker. And he points to it just like that. That video, for a brief period, became, for like 24 hours, was the most watched piece of video in the world on YouTube. You know, that Lucy, you know, wins a Pulitzer Prize. I was present for the fly.
He was practicing for Osama.
Exactly.
And as I recall, it was a very hardwood line after, and you just said, "Nice."
Yeah. Yeah, and actually they made that. Somebody made a rap video out of it. Some guy. It was like a rap remix. It was awesome. You can see
Wow.
it. It's on the internet.
So this is almost like when you liked Michael Jackson. I mean, it was like really
Yes,
Rick James or
I
something.
was
right?
injected into pop culture in this way.
That's right.
It doesn't take much to entertain.
The one other thing I want to talk about, and then actually we might do something serious, but I really would, I think it's interesting to talk in kind of a slow motion description of the unraveling of Rick Perry. So there you are, you're the moderator, along with Maria Bartiromo from CNBC, the financial anchor, who isn't really a political expert. She's
Right.
there because she's the most beautiful person at CNBC, and also because she's the anchor of the big After the Bell show. So and it was actually, by the way, I thought a terrific moment in interviewing. But why don't you describe what happened?
What happened? I know all these debates run together, and they certainly do for me. But you know, the candidates complain. By the way, there are too many debates, and they say that, you know, news organizations are doing it for their own benefit, and they're, you know, putting us through hell and messing with our schedules. There's some truth to that. It's great. Newspapers and television networks love to promote themselves through events like this. So that's life. So we have our CNBC debate. There had been a series of ones coming up in the fall. You are somewhat at the mercy, when you have these debates, of the mood that the candidates walk into the room with. Sometimes they have a real motive to mix it up and fight and argue, which is what tends to make the most interesting and electric moments. And other times, they're just in like stand pat, play it safe mode. As it happened, there was a debate the previous week, or maybe 2 weeks earlier, when the Republicans had viciously gone after Romney. Rick Perry had really gone after him, Gingrich a little bit. And there was a reaction within the party that they were too negative. And so they had they walked into this debate with the motive of smoothing it over. So I start from the beginning with questions to Romney about, you know, the issue of flip-flops, which is an allegation that's sort of followed him for a long time, and I invited Perry to tee off on that. And Perry at that time was still somebody that we thought might emerge as the ultimate challenger to Romney, and he just wouldn't bite. He wouldn't do it. And in fact, none of the candidates had any motive to mix it up with one another. They had just decided they weren't going to. Gingrich did a little smackdown of Maria. You know, Gingrich does like to play the media in the debates, his strategy. Romney, when you're in a family fight, which is what primaries are, campaigns are wary of offending people who are otherwise on their side, you know, the supporters of the fellow party members. So they look for other targets, and Romney's strategy has been to attack Obama, ignore the other Republicans, and Newt's has been to attack the media. And Maria asked a question. She asked the candidates to start talking about health care and said, 30 seconds, give me your health care plan. And 3 of them give their answers, just perfectly normal and routine. And Newt Gingrich says, you've asked an absurd question. And so he, you know, and Maria, to her credit, sort of stood up and said, well, are you going to answer it? And he said, well, it was really absurd. She said, are you going to answer it? And then he finally backed down and answered the question. But that still was kind of weak tea. And halfway through the debate, we were all dying in our own heads because we didn't have any, I couldn't think of what the lead of the story was. There wasn't one. And then a gift from God in the form of Rick Perry arrived. When Rick Perry begins talking, and he's getting all Texas like swaggery about it. He goes, let me tell you something. When I get in there, there's 3 agencies that are going to go. Okay? Education, energy, or education, commerce, and that's the third one. And he stops, and it was kind of like strange. Is he kidding? And there starts to be a little low rumble of laughter in the thing, and Ron Paul is trying to help him out and says, I'd cut 5 agencies. And it's getting a little uncomfortable now, and then Mitt Romney says, EPA? Is that the third one?
And in your ear,
Right, and so at that moment, when it's kind of chaos and laughter, one of the imperatives you have when you're moderating a thing like that is to keep it moving, keep it interesting. So Maria decides to go to another question, and she begins to ask a question about the budget deficit. At that moment, a very smart producer in our truck who realized that this candidate was drowning in front of our eyes and would like to give him a little longer opportunity to drown.
throwing an anchor to a drowning man, right? So
exactly. Shouts, he opens up the switch to my ear, because he can talk to any one of us, and says, don't stop with this, okay? So I cut Maria off, and I said, okay, hold on a second, Governor. Is EPA because Romney had said it, laughter, and Perry had said something like, yeah, EPA. I said, is that the one you're talking about? And in a way that was like mystifyingly generous to me, Perry says, no, actually, that wasn't the third one. I should have known that that was not the third one in his riff, but I didn't know. And
you didn't know what the answer was.
No, I hadn't. I did not.
Did you have an oops moment too?
What's that?
Were you having an oops moment too?
No. It's just that I had not absorbed the little riff in his speech where in the stump speech where he talked about the third agency. So he said, I said, is EPA the third one? He said, no, sir, it wasn't. And I said, okay, can you name the third one? And then he really like doubled up and said, okay, it's education, commerce, and then he just kind of surrendered and he said, oops. And it became one of those moments that was an indescribable little moment that was entirely the result of him, the result of my smart producer, and a little rudimentary back and forth between me and him. So,
Well, it was great. So.
and the best part about it, from my standpoint, I mentioned this earlier in our talk. When I did the interview with Obama on The Fly, my friend Maureen Dowd wrote a column in the New York Times about this incident, and the kicker was, and sad to say for John Harwood, no matter what else happens in his career, the first line of his obituary will always be, he was the one sitting there when Barack Obama killed the fly. So the Perry thing happens, that was bigger, and I wrote her a note and I said, can you rewrite my obituary now? I think Perry gets a little mention in there.
I think we could thank you for getting rid of Rick Perry.
Well, which raises one other thing, and I think I'll make this sort of our introduction to conservative, liberal kind of media, and then we'll bring some others up here in the limited time we have remaining. But in a different interview, in a different debate, shortly after that, Newt Gingrich really took off on John King from CNN for the question he asked, and it became really sort of an issue, and a lot of people thought King was sort of off base with that question, and I thought I'd just, in this world of highly politicized debate and media, what did you think of that?
I don't think he was off base at all with this question. I think you had to ask that question, especially in the context in which, first of all, character is an issue, people running for president, and you had a proximate news event, which was this interview that Marianne Gingrich was giving, which wasn't entirely different in terms of the nature of the information, but nevertheless, I think it was something that was worth asking about. I might not have asked it as the very first question, but I think the more challenging thing was the ferocity of Newt's response to it, which was beautifully played on his part, and it became an independent factor in the election to his benefit, to the South Carolina benefit. When I don't think it would be, a moderator could be prepared for how strongly Gingrich came back, because that was a very remarkable thing. For John, I wish that he had had a different response to it. John is a great journalist and a friend, and very skilled on television. But when he responded to Gingrich by saying something to the effect that, well, it wasn't my network that put it on, and Gingrich said, wait a minute, don't hide behind the other network, that was a legitimate comeback on Gingrich's part, because John was injecting it into the debate. And I wonder how history might have played out differently had Gingrich says, John, it's despicable and appalling that you asked me that question. It would have been a somewhat risky thing for King to do, but I think he would have been well-founded if he said, well, hold on, Mr. Speaker. There are some people who evaluate presidential candidates and care about the character of the candidates who think that what your ex-wife said that you did was despicable. So would you like to defend that? I think that would have been a legitimate way to come back at that, and it didn't happen, and so John got some criticism for that, and Gingrich was off to the races in South Carolina.
Lucy, let's hear from some more panelists.
All right. Next, we are going to bring up Neil Brown, who's my boss. He's editor at the Tampa Bay Times, formerly known as the St. Petersburg Times. When you've spent 43 years saying St. Petersburg Times, it's hard to change, especially when you're old and crotchety. Neil is originally from Chicago, but we won't hold being a damn Yankee against him, since I also married a Chicagoan. He started as a reporter at the Miami Herald, spent about 8 years there. I think you even covered the Keys, didn't you? What a posh assignment down there with all the dope smokers in the Keys. Then he went to Congressional Quarterly, where he was managing editor, and then joined the St. Petersburg Times in 1993 as, were you world editor? Did we call it world editor? See what it
Love that title.
It's a great title. Then in 2001 became the editor, where he has presided now over the recent change in name to the Tampa Bay Times, and we're going to get him to tell us a little bit about the name change and what he's doing to sort of calm the troops and keep things going.
Take your pick. Open seating.
Open seating. Is this on? Can you hear me? It's important. Anytime you're with Lucy, hug first. Skeen, you didn't tell me I'd be answering questions from Lucy Morgan.
You wouldn't have come.
You're probably all right. I wouldn't have come. On everybody's table is a copy of the Tampa Bay Times. Everybody got one? All right. I'm gonna stand here for a minute if that's all right, because, well, can you see me if I sit?
Yeah.
All right. No. See. Okay. Good. Glad somebody's honest there. On the copy on everybody's table is a copy of the Tampa Bay Times, which you can't get here in Tallahassee, unfortunately, in print anymore. So I had some sent up.
Since 1974, I think, but
No, just since a couple of years ago. And I want to open and get to your question about the Tampa Bay Times by telling a little story. If you think that our decision to change the name was a really good idea, then you can thank me and some others. If you think changing the name to the St. Pete Times to Tampa Bay Times is a bad idea, I'm going to show you how you can blame Neil Skeen. Okay? So bear with me. Here's how the story works. So Lucy said that I started my career, which is true, at the Miami Herald in the Key West Bureau. Okay? Downhill ever since, I need to tell you, okay? But I covered the Keys, and like Lucy, we just had to write a lot of stories. We used to have to take our own pictures. In fact, there was a great source of mine, a little Elliot Ness kind of guy named Allison DeFore, who would call every so often and sort of say, he was the assistant state attorney at the time, I got a good one, bring your camera. So I would run off and write a story about some drug bust that they were doing and take pictures. And in fact, I did a lot of those stories down in the Keys. And out of the blue one day, I get a call from an FDLE agent who says, I've seen your work, it's pretty good work. I got to tell you about some corruption down in Key West. So I go meet this guy for coffee, and he says, I need you to know I never talked to any reporters ever, except one. And he nods like I should know, and he says, Lucy Morgan, right? To which I say, who's Lucy Morgan? Didn't know anything. But anyways, he wound up cooperating quite a lot. We wrote a lot about corruption. Got some good 1A stories in the Miami Herald when it had a great Key West bureau. And I get promoted to go to Palm Beach County. I go, again, when the Herald had a Palm Beach office, and we can talk about what sort of happened to the business in general, but I go to the Palm Beach office, and they immediately send me to, I got to do 2 different sessions, cover the sessions up here in Tallahassee. And I came up to Tallahassee for the Miami Herald, and we had this great adjoining office with, it was Steve Doig and Mike Olive were the Herald folks, you must remember them, some of you may. And right across the way were Neil Skeen and John Harwood. And, you know, it was this great, rich tradition of the Miami Herald, St. Pete Times, coverage of Tallahassee. And you can go back to people like Bob Shaw and others, and frankly, the great open records work, laws that we have in the state and sunshine laws we have. We can thank those 2 institutions for that kind of commitment. They really helped write those laws. And so I got to work with Neil and John. The cologne was everywhere. You're absolutely right. And I learned a lot working for them and working right beside them. And it was sort of it was a really respectful competition, but there was a competition. You could tell that the adjoining door would suddenly close when somebody had a scoop. And off they would go, or off Doig and Olive would go. And I did 2 sessions that way, and I learned a ton. And so then I moved back down to Miami and covered politics in Miami. And shortly thereafter, John left to go to Washington, and Neil left to become the editor of the St. Pete Times Evening Institution, then the Evening Independent. Right? That was in 85, 86, something like that. He was the 84. And so under Neil was the very young executive editor of the Evening Independent. Well, Neil, on your watch, they closed the paper.
I noticed that.
Right? They
Came in one day and it was gone. It was
November 1986, they closed the newspaper. Sad day. PM paper couldn't exist. And Gene Patterson, just 30-some days later, the very next month, announced that with the money and the resources saved by closing the Evening Independent, the St. Pete Times was going to expand fully into Hillsborough County and go after the Tampa Tribune. So, thanks to Neil, we moved into Tampa and Hillsborough County. And of course, Neil went off to run Congressional Quarterly, and he did a great job, and that's where I actually met him. Well, met him again, because I knew him from before, and he hired me to CQ. But it's funny how all that sort of stuff sort of kind of comes full circle, because at the time, the Times ventured into Tampa with a vengeance, and we had a circulation of some 20,000 in Tampa, and thought, well, the truly great work of John Harwood and Neil Skeen and Lucy Morgan, who then went on to be the leader in Tallahassee, and others would carry the day in Tampa. Well, candidly, it was harder than we thought. We had a formidable opponent, the Tampa Tribune. And for the longest time, there was still only a circulation of 25,000 for the St. Pete Times in Tampa. But then the world started to change. And thanks to frankly, the unique and independent ownership of the St. Petersburg Times, we stuck with it. We stuck with it with a sizable bureau here in Tallahassee, with a sense that newspapers matter, and I thank you all for being here because I know you're here because you're still believers in newspapers. And at a time when a lot of other organizations might have folded and said, well, you can't do it on 20,000, we sort of stuck with it. In part because at the St. Pete Times we felt that there still was a need for not only a great newspaper in St. Petersburg, but a newspaper for the Tampa Bay region, and frankly a statewide paper, which I'm sorry to report there's not as many anymore. We may be the only one left. So over time, we stuck with it, and it actually brought us to the point of this past fall when we ultimately changed the name of the paper, and I want to explain a little bit about that. So it was 20,000 for a long time, and this wasn't going as well. All the Pulitzers, all the great work wasn't enough to win over the audience in Hillsborough County. But we did have two different visions versus our competitors. We did see regionalism as a good thing, that there is a strong metropolitan area to be had in the Tampa Bay market. And so, again, we stuck with it. We had a bureau in Tampa as big as any in the state. We have more reporters than everybody. And in the last 6 to 7 years, something tipped over. Between our good journalism, our stick-to-itiveness, some smarts on the business side, and the biggest criticism we heard over the years was we didn't have enough ads in that Tampa edition, as you guys may remember. But we made real gains. And while we have been extremely warmly received, obviously here in Tallahassee with Lucy and Steve Bosquet and others representing us, and many great journalists have come through this office, up here you appreciated the St. Petersburg Times to some degree a little bit more than some folks in Hillsborough County. So we did great muckraking, groundbreaking journalism, investigative journalism throughout, local journalism, but we weren't entirely getting the credit. And one reason why is that you all sort of feel it, whether it's the Democrat or your hometown paper. People feel a real connection to their local paper, and the name matters, as we found out. The journalism matters first and foremost, but the name matters too. So as we continued to grow, and as I said, about 6 or 7 years ago, things really started to turn. We made some great gains. We put a great commitment of resource into the journalism. And come this fall, we had reached the point where 75% of the readers of the St. Petersburg Times lived outside St. Petersburg. What's more, on Sunday, our circulation of our Sunday edition in Hillsborough County alone was 120,000. Now, that was telling us something that we needed to take a further step. As you may know, and I'm proud to tell you, the St. Pete Times for a long time has been the largest paper in the state of Florida. Our Sunday circulation is about 414,000. Orlando is second to us at 280,000 on Sunday. What's more, and this is somewhat of a sad commentary on the state of newspapers in general, the St. Petersburg Times in November, when we were still the St. Petersburg Times, at 414, had become the 11th largest paper in America, bigger than the Boston Globe, bigger than the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Dallas Morning News. So our work had been recognized. We won 2 Pulitzers in 2009. We've pushed hard, and yet we still were not receiving full credit from a business standpoint in the region that we all call home. Interestingly, when Gene Patterson, who was the chairman of the company that pushed us into Hillsborough County in 1987, after closing a paper, there's a quote from the story where he announced we're moving into Hillsborough. Gene might have been premature, prescient, visionary, just like Nelson Pointer. He said, we want to be the paper for Florida's biggest city, the city of Tampa Bay. Now, that's hard to come by. We all have our identity, and we're always trying to juggle our local identity with our regional and state identity. And I think it's okay to have several, frankly. We don't ask anybody to not say they're from Tampa or to not say they're from St. Petersburg. You're from Tampa Bay. We can be part of both. But we felt it was time to go ahead and make the move to reflect not only the region, how the region saw itself. All the sports teams call themselves Tampa Bay. As I said, 75% of our market was outside of St. Petersburg. But also what our aspiration is. And we actually think that as an agenda setter that a newspaper and news organization should be, we needed to see things in a broader sense. So come November 1st, we announced that we were going to become the Tampa Bay Times. We understood, we did a lot of market research. I was telling Ron Sachs a moment ago, you know, you don't mess with a great brand, or let's put it this way, you mess with a great brand at your own peril. But we had felt that we could stand by great journalism, great advertising content, that frankly, if it's no good, it doesn't matter what you call it, and if it's really good, it doesn't matter what you call it. And so on the 1st of January, the St. Petersburg Times, with a little bit of melancholy in all our hearts, but with great sense of promise, became the Tampa Bay Times. You have copies on your desk. It's only 5 weeks into it, so I got an early report. So far, so good. In St. Petersburg, where we expected the biggest backlash, if you will, we've got actually a lot of support. A lot of pride, frankly, in the St. Petersburg Times in St. Pete. There's a lot of people who say, gee, I wish you hadn't done that. Maybe some of you are feeling the same way. But I get it. That if you want to serve a wider market, you need a name that reflects that market. In Hillsborough County, it's only one small measure, but in the 6 weeks leading up to the name change, our net gain in circulation had been about 300 copies. In the 5 weeks since, we've gained 3,200 copies. Does the name make that much difference? I don't know, but so far that's all we've really done is change the name. We're going to continue to market it and things like that. So things are off to a very strong start. We are a company that still believes in newspapers. We believe in our website. We believe that we've got some great ideas for and how to basically reach audiences in all kind of ways, online and in print. We're constantly thinking up new things. Like all of you, we could stand for this economy to do a little better, to get the income that we think we can get. But the name change, we think, is a vision for our region and a vision for Florida and a vision for journalism. And it's gone really well. So thank you, Neil. Now I'll sit down.
The flight of the Phoenix, that's really
Yeah,
all it is. So.
At the risk of my job here, let me ask Neil another question. It seems to me that one
Really
of the...
let him have it.
Okay. Well, it seems to me that all of us are collaborating a little more than we used to. The Times and the Herald operate a single bureau here. At the moment, we have 10 people in the combined Tampa Bay Times, Miami Herald Bureau. Is this one of the paths that you see the newspaper industry taking for the future?
I do, actually, which is it's kind of like quality over quantity when you think about it. Okay, so when John and Neil were in one room and Olive and Dorig and me and some other folks were in another room, we all did great work, but we also often all showed up to cover the same event. Okay? Now, let's face it, the business model is different. It's hard. A lot of newspapers, well, you know it here, there's a lot smaller press corps here than there ever was. So we decided there are power in numbers. And while, listen, had the Miami Herald been across the bay, we would never have done it. But a lot of us are ex-Herald folks. It was compatible values. We said, why don't we go all in and form a true, what I like to think of as a journalistic powerhouse by taking two of the great news organizations in the state and combining resources. So we have Steve Bosquet covering one thing and Mary Ellen Kloss covering something else, and we are expanding coverage in Tallahassee in a different economic time. Yes, is there a loss of competition? To some degree, yes, but I have to tell you, straight up, I've come to see that some of that competition was ego-driven and didn't have service to the readers or accountability to democracy behind it. Because, you know, what's the difference if somebody has something in the 20th graph of a story that somebody may or may not read? If we have two different stories, that's more and better coverage. And so you can't do it with everything. I couldn't obviously do it with the Tampa Tribune. We do believe in competition. But I think it's an extremely, not just cost effective, because ultimately we didn't save any money. We just got a lot more money for what we were spending. And so we're very proud of this partnership, and we think it's really, it's really the way to go. You got to pick your shots, including you got to pick your partner as well. It's got to be compatible. And fortunately, the news values of the Tampa Bay Times and the Miami Herald remain very strong.
Could I just have one postscript to that and make the observation that that sort of collaboration is a growing fact of life throughout the news business. One small example, I didn't even know about this until recently because I don't deal that much with the local NBC station that, although they're housed in the same building where the NBC bureau is, where I do a lot of television, the ABC, NBC, and CBS affiliates in Washington, D.C. now pool video coverage of most scheduled news events in Washington. That is, where it used to be everybody showed up with a crew and a correspondent. Now, in the same way that news organizations have pool coverage of White House events of the president, and that's for practical reasons because, I mean, there's financial savings involved, but also you couldn't practically have all these news organizations cover the same event. There are too many of them. But even where the mayor of Washington, D.C. has a press conference, there's now one pool camera for all those news organizations. They compete on the stuff that they think is the highest added value journalism, whether it's the investigative stuff they do or the more local TV-oriented things like the great car chase or the spectacular piece of local video from a breaking news event. They may will send their own cameras to that. But on the routine, like political, governmental stuff, it's now pooled in the same way.
I want to add to the conversation at this point somebody who's not a journalist and is extracting profitability and growth from the work of the journalists.
Wait, you mean he's like sucking our lifeblood?
He's sucking your lifeblood.
Dang.
And he's going to come up and defend himself for this. Justin Safey was a speechwriter, I think the first speechwriter for Jeb Bush as governor, then was the communications director, meaning that he was on the other side of the issues from Lucy and these guys. He is now the founding shareholder and attorney in his own government consulting firm, the Safey Law Firm. He was appointed by President George Bush, to the Council on White House Fellows in 2007. But when he left here in 2002, he began publishing something called the Safey Review. Many of you may still see the Safey Review, and it collects the headlines and points you to the stories from newspapers and blogs and television from all over the state. And by the way, I also wanted to say, since we're going to talk about conservative and liberal media, Justin is also a frequent guest on Fox News. So I'd like for him to come up and join this group, Justin Safey.
I tried. Yeah, good move.
Maybe Justin could tell us where the story would play if Jeb Bush were indicted tomorrow. Where would we see that on Safey Review in the morning?
You'd see it right there with all the other articles.
At the bottom, maybe?
Probably.
Wouldn't it depend on what the crime was?
No, it wouldn't. It doesn't matter.
Well, Justin, you've heard all of this, and I wonder if you might think a little bit about your own strategy, your own approach to media, and where is all this going from where you've been and where you're headed?
Well, it's interesting because I started this site on August 16th, 2002, which is remarkable that it's going to be 10 years this August. And there was no YouTube, there was no Facebook, there was no Twitter. None of these things that have become so dominant on the internet today didn't exist back then. And for me, the model that I looked at was a site called the Drudge Report. And the Drudge Report to me was remarkable because it was one page, not a lot of original content, but an incredibly useful resource because the editors were pulling content from all over the internet. And what occurred to me was that in Florida, we have such a wonderfully diverse state, so many interesting political stories, that there was no single page that someone could go to that was interested in state politics and get all of it. I also was frustrated because when I went back to Miami after working here in Tallahassee, it was very difficult for me to surf the different newspapers' websites and to dig into the different pages and to find the content that I was looking for, which was I wanted information about Governor Bush's reelection campaign. That year, Bill McBride and Janet Reno were seeking the Democratic nomination, and I had formerly worked for the governor, and I was curious to see how his reelection campaign was going, and there was no resource like that. So I created it, and I provide that context because 10 years in the online business is 10 eternities. And now the way that things are going is that my model of having a human editor I still think is a very valuable model because we are drowning in more information than ever before. And or at least I know I am, and I can't read everything I want to read. So the value of having someone that's a trusted source to aggregate links, I think, is of value. And because even Google, with all the brilliant engineers that work at Google and the smart people that work in Mountain View, they still can't produce with their algorithms, as brilliant as they are. If you go to the Google search engine and type in Florida political news, you will still not get a results page. Even if you go to Google News and do that, you will still not get a results page that delivers the value that we deliver on our page because of the human editorial function that we provide, where we put the most salient stories at the top and the less important stories at the bottom.
Particularly if something bad has happened to a Republican.
Of course.
Okay.
You would expect no less. Actually, Lucy and I are joking. The site is, I am a registered Republican. I voted for John McCain in the last election. I voted for Rick Scott. And so, but my
You
site,
voted for Rick Scott?
I voted for Rick Scott for governor. But my politics are well known, but the site itself is nonpartisan. Okay, all we do is pull links. There's no original content. I don't write a blog. I don't put any of my own viewpoints onto the site. It is meant to be a nonpartisan site where people who are interested in Florida politics can go. One advantage that I had at the time is that I knew that at that time there wasn't this spirit of collaboration that existed between the newspapers. They were still very much into super hyper competitive mode, and so I knew that no newspaper would ever link to a story that appeared on another newspaper's website. They would never do it. It wouldn't even cross their mind. So I knew that there was a little niche there of someone that was willing to be agnostic about it and to basically say, you know what, I don't care where it comes from. My only criteria was that it come from a major Florida daily, and that's when I put it up on the site. So now I find it remarkable. Okay, you asked me where this is going. Where it's going is that newspapers now are aggregating content themselves. The New York Times does it. The St. Pete Times posts links to other newspapers on their site. The Orlando Sentinel does it. The Palm Beach Post does it as well. So it's really interesting. I think the future is going to be more along the lines of producing original content. It's going to be sharing content and being a resource to pointing people to where good content exists elsewhere on the internet, that there's too much information out there for anyone to think that they're going to be able to be the single source of information for what people are looking for in the news today. I think both of those functions are important. I also think that people are going to rely more, and they are already doing it, on their social networks to get information. They're going to rely on their friends on Facebook, their friends on Twitter. Twitter and Facebook are the biggest aggregators on the internet. Okay, they send more traffic to websites than they did for sure 5 years from now, and 5 years ago, and 5 years from now they'll do even more. The other thing that I think the future is also on mobile devices, and I think that's a market that we're exploring into. We're getting close to about 5,000 downloaded iPhone apps for our app. We have a safety review app that puts our content on iPhones, and so we want to dominate that mobile space for people that are interested in Florida politics. Because as we get further along, more and more people are going to be consuming information from their mobile devices. And the final point I make about where we're going is we're going to niche publications. My publication is a niche publication. It's only about Florida politics. And if you ever read the article or read the book by Chris Anderson called The Long Tail, basically the long tail is the story of how niche publications, niche industries, or niche businesses, content businesses, can actually become profitable and work on their own, and they don't have to be blockbuster 300,000 circulation to actually become profitable, because distribution of information on the internet the cost of it is practically nothing. When I started my website, my monthly web fee for hosting my site was $19.95 a month. And I could get people across the world. I've gotten emails from people in China and India and Iraq who read the site for $19.99 a month, okay? I didn't have to pay for the newspaper carriers to get up early in the morning and pick up the papers and deliver them personally at people's home. That would be, that's a barrier to entry. So on the internet, there's no barrier to entry. The cost of distribution is practically nothing. So because of that, it allows someone like me to develop a site that it has enough of a following. In the last 2 years, we've had 10 million page views on our site in the last 2 years.
Perhaps
So-
you should be paying a fee to the newspapers whose stories you're putting up there.
Somehow I had a feeling that someone would suggest that. And what I would say is that our site is the biggest, one of the biggest, well, I won't say one of the biggest. Our site, of those 10 million page views that we've got in the last 2 years, we've driven 5 million visitors to Florida's newspapers. We've sent 5 million visitors to Florida's newspapers in the last, and who made money off of those visitors that I sent? The St. Pete Times did, the Miami Herald did, the Orlando Sentinel did, because they monetized the revenue from the visitors that I drove them based on the ad impressions that I gave them, and I'm not even charging them a referral fee to send them all those to send them all those visitors. And I'm a lawyer, and so I know something about referral fees. And if you're in other businesses, typically when someone sends you a customer, a paying customer, not typically, but it's not unusual for that to happen. So from my perspective, I know that the Orlando Sentinel told me that we're averaging sending the Orlando Sentinel about 400,000 page views per month. The last time I checked with the Miami Herald, we're the #1 referrer of traffic to the Miami Herald Naked Politics blog. The Tampa Tribune has told me that I'm in the top 10 websites that refer traffic to the Tampa Tribune website. So our site is in the top 10 refers to the Tampa Tribune. So I look at it from the perspective of I am providing free marketing to the newspapers and driving paying customers to view their ads, which they monetize.
Neil, are you super grateful?
Here's the thing, and we all are struggling with this. The amount of money we make off the advertising from the referrals from the safety review wouldn't be enough to pay the referral fee, because the advertising dollars online are still so small when you get right down to it.
I want to say one thing, because I do want Joe to come up too, but just say something about the sort of what publishers called the switch from print dollars to internet nickels.
Yeah. Well, it's just a straight rate issue, okay? Because, and by the way, I want to say I agree with everything Justin said, and I do think, listen, in addition to, obviously, we got to find ways to pay for the content we're generating. First of all, we're generating content. Justin's aggregating it, and to a great degree, it does expand the reach of the Tampa Bay Times and the Miami Herald and everybody else. We actually want everybody to see our journalism as much as we can. Unfortunately, to the question you have, is that because we don't know who those people are, because there's not very much registration, there's not the same, for a print newspaper, you sign up and you ask them to bring it to your house and you tell them who you are. We don't have that issue on the website. As a result, it's literally 5 to 10 cents on the dollar in terms of the advertising rates that we can get for online traffic. I'm not looking to give a gift horse in the mouth. We're trying to diversify, find all kind of ways. I think ultimately we all have to get past the notion that there's a choice. It's either print or online. Everybody is living in this world with an excellent mix of print and online, depending on your lifestyle, depending on the day of the week, depending on who's in your household. Actually, the Tampa Bay Times started a publication 5 years ago called TBT. It is a print tabloid geared to young readers. And it is our fastest growing product with the most traffic and higher ad revenues than we get online.